When I first got the call about the job, I almost said no. The idea of working the night shift at an old, abandoned asylum wasn't exactly my dream gig, but I was desperate. Bills were piling up, and my last job had let me go without notice. So, when the manager on the other end of the line assured me that the job was quiet and manageable, I reluctantly agreed. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my gut and hung up the phone. The asylum sat on the outskirts of town, a hulking gray building with shattered windows and vines crawling up its walls like skeletal fingers. Its official name was Black Ridge Mental Institution, but the locals called it the House of Whispers. They claimed it had been shut down decades ago after a series of incidents. What kind of incidents? Nobody seemed to agree. Some said patients vanished. Others claimed the staff went insane. A few old-timers even swore the building was cursed. It was just urban legend nonsense, or so I thought. My first night, I arrived just as the sun was setting. The parking lot was empty, except for one other car, a beat-up sedan with a missing hubcap. The manager, a gaunt man in his 50s named Mr. Harlan, met me at the front gate. He barely looked at me as he handed over a ring of old-fashioned keys. "You'll be in charge of making sure nobody sneaks in," he said flatly. "Kids like to break in for dares. You'll patrol the halls, check the locks, and report anything unusual." He must have noticed the doubt on my face because he added, "You'll be fine. Just stick to the main floors and don't wander off." His tone was dismissive, almost hurried, as if he wanted to leave before the sun fully dipped below the horizon. Before I could ask any questions, he mumbled something about the cameras and practically ran to his car. His taillights disappeared down the winding road, leaving me alone with the asylum. I stood there for a moment, staring at the entrance. The heavy wooden doors were cracked and weathered, the brass handles green with tarnish. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, shattered tiles, and old wheelchairs abandoned in the corners. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faintest echo of footsteps, but when I turned, no one was there. The first hour passed uneventfully. I wandered through the hallways, trying to get a feel for the layout. The building was massive, with endless corridors that all seemed to look the same. I tried not to think about how eerily quiet it was, how the only sounds were my own breathing and the occasional creak of old wood beneath my boots. At one point, I found an old map pinned to a bulletin board. It listed floors that weren't on the schedule Mr. Harlan had given me. Basement Level B was circled in red, but the ink had smudged as if someone had tried to erase it. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I forced myself to look away. Then there was the security office. It was the only room in the building that felt remotely modern. A bank of monitors lined one wall, displaying grainy footage of the hallways and main entrance. I could see my own figure on one of the screens, standing in the office. But then, just as I turned to check another monitor, I caught a flicker of movement on the screen behind me. Someone, or something, darted across the hallway I'd just patrolled. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the empty hallway outside. Nothing. The air was still. I stepped out cautiously, my footsteps echoing as I checked every corner. Whatever it was gone. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Long shifts and stress could play tricks on the mind. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something had been there. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the asylum grew heavier, like the walls were pressing in. shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and I started hearing faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks, but no matter where I went, the whispers followed. They weren't words exactly, more like a soft murmur, just on the edge of understanding. I shook it off as paranoia, but the unease in my chest grew stronger with every passing hour. Just after midnight, I stumbled across a door that wasn't on the map. It was old and rusted, with a small metal plaque that read Ward C, Restricted. The keyhole glinted under my flashlight, and I hesitated. The door was locked, and for some reason, I was relieved. The air around it felt colder, like it was leaking some kind of invisible chill. I decided to leave it alone, but as I walked away, I swear I heard something on the other side. A faint scratching sound, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across metal. By the time my shift ended, my nerves were shot. I clocked out in the security office, grateful for the first light of dawn creeping through the broken windows. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught the security monitors again. The screen showing the hallway outside Ward C was flickering, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. By the time I arrived for my second shift, the dread I felt from the previous night had only grown stronger. I'd spent the day trying to convince myself that I'd just been on edge, that the flickering screens and strange noises were nothing more than an old building settling into itself. But as I stood outside the asylum's Lumen entrance once again, clutching the ring of keys, I knew deep down that something wasn't right. The wind whistled through the cracked windows above, carrying with it a faint sound that could have been laughter, or maybe just my imagination. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the asylum in deep shadows. I stepped inside and locked the doors behind me, already counting the hours until I could leave. This time, I decided to start my patrol in the West Wing, a part of the asylum I hadn't explored much the previous night. The air here was colder, with a dampness that clung to my skin. The long corridor was lined with doors leading to old patient rooms, each one labeled with a rusted brass plate. Most of the doors were ajar, revealing nothing but decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. But one door near the end of the hall was closed, its plate scratched beyond recognition. As I approached, I noticed the faintest sound coming from behind it. It was subtle at first, like the hum of distant machinery, but it grew louder the closer I got, a rhythmic tapping. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone or something was on the other side waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat as the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence, and then a soft voice whispered my name. I staggered back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I shined the beam at the door, half expecting it to swing open. But nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I forced myself to step away, telling myself I must have misheard. Maybe the wind through the cracks in the building had created some illusion. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I hurried out of the West Wing, my footsteps echoing louder than I'd like. In the security office, I tried to shake the unease. The flickering monitors displayed the same grainy images as the night before. I watched each feed carefully, hoping to catch some normalcy in the empty hallways. But just as I settled into the chair, one of the monitors caught my eye. It was the West Wing hallway. The door with the scratched plate was slightly open now, though I had distinctly remembered it being shut tight when I left. A cold chill ran down my spine as I leaned closer to the screen. The door creaked open a little more. My breath hitched as something moved just beyond the frame. Too quick to make out, but unmistakable. I froze, torn between rushing back to check and staying put. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this asylum didn't want me here. I decided to continue my patrol, staying far away from the west wing. The eastern wing was no better. I walked past an old common area where chairs were overturned and dusty board games lay abandoned on tables. My flashlight caught a faint trail of something on the floor. Dark, smeared streaks leading toward a door marked "Staff Only." My stomach churned as I knelt to inspect it. It looked too much like dried blood to be anything else. I pushed open the staff door with trembling hands. Inside, the air was suffocatingly still. The room was filled with dusty filing cabinets and broken chairs, but what caught my attention was the far wall. Written in jagged, uneven letters was a message scrawled in what looked like red paint. Or worse, it read, "Do not trust them." I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my grip. Who had written it? And who were they? The whispering voices I'd heard the night before seemed to echo in my mind, and I felt a wave of nausea as I struggled to steady myself. I didn't stay in the room long. Whatever answers it held weren't worth the growing sense of dread that gripped my chest. The rest of the night was no less unsettling. At one point, as I walked through the central hall, I felt a sudden gust of cold air rush past me. It was sharp and unnatural, like the icy breath of something unseen. Then there were the footsteps, faint, echoing, and always just far enough behind me that I couldn't catch whoever or whatever was making them. I spun around several times, my flashlight sweeping the halls, but I was always alone. When the clock finally struck 6 a.m., I felt like I could collapse from relief. As I locked up and stepped outside, the dawn light was already creeping over the horizon. But just as I turned to leave, I glanced back at the asylum's upper windows. For a brief moment, I could swear I saw a shadowy figure standing in one of them, watching me. By the third night, I was starting to regret taking this job. The unsettling incidents weren't just coincidences, they were piling up. The whispers, the shadow in the window, the strange markings, it all pointed to something far beyond the ordinary, but I couldn't afford to quit. So, when I pulled into the asylum's empty parking lot again, I took a deep breath and told myself to get through another shift. As I approached the front door, I noticed something odd. A piece of paper had been taped to it, fluttering slightly in the cold night breeze. The handwriting was jagged and rushed, almost as if it had been written in a panic. The note read, "Follow the rules. If you don't, you won't make it through the night." I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Rules? No one had mentioned anything about rules before. I ripped the note off the door and shoved it into my pocket, trying to ignore the pit forming in my stomach. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual. The asylum's decaying halls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I made my way to the security office, determined to check the cameras before anything else. As I sat down, I unfolded the note again and read it more carefully. Below the warning, 6 rules were scrawled in the same frantic handwriting. Rule 1. Never leave the main halls between midnight and 3:33 a.m. Rule 2. If you hear knocking, do not open the door no matter what. Rule 3. If the lights flicker, count to 10. If they don't stabilize, leave the area immediately. Rule 4. If you see someone standing in the hallway, do not speak to them. Do not look directly at them. Rule 5. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. Rule 6. Always leave before dawn. Never stay past 6 a.m. I read the list twice, my hands trembling slightly. Was this a joke? A prank from one of the staff? But something about the hurried writing and the ominous tone told me otherwise. Whoever had written this note seemed genuinely terrified. I folded the paper and stuffed it back into my pocket, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Still, I couldn't ignore the rules completely. Part of me, the part that had heard whispers and seen shadows, wanted to believe them. The night started out uneventfully with my usual patrol of the main halls. I walked past the patient rooms, some of which still had old medical equipment scattered inside. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, a smell that didn't make sense in a building abandoned for decades. Around midnight, things began to change. The lights flickered suddenly, casting the hallway in a strobe-like glow. I froze, remembering the third rule. Slowly, I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 10, the lights had stabilized, but the silence that followed was deafening, like the asylum itself was holding its breath. I continued walking, gripping my flashlight tightly. As I passed by one of the larger patient wards, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, coming from behind the door marked Ward C. My heart sank. The second rule flashed through my mind. If you hear knocking, do not open the door, no matter what. The knocking was rhythmic, almost polite, as if someone inside was waiting for me to let them out. Then a voice called out, muffled but clear, "Help me, please." It sounded weak, almost childlike. I froze, torn between my instincts and the warning on the note. I stepped closer to the door, my hand hovering over the handle. "Please," the voice whispered again, this time more urgent. But something about it felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too calculated. I backed away, the rule replaying in my mind like a mantra. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't something I wanted to face. The asylum wasn't finished with me yet. As I turned a corner into the east wing, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. My flashlight flickered, casting its shape in and out of focus. It was tall and gaunt, its arms hanging unnaturally at its sides. For a split second, I thought it might be another staff member, but then I remembered the fourth rule. Do not speak to them. Do not look directly at them. I averted my eyes, my heart pounding as I tried to keep walking without acknowledging the figure. The air around me grew colder with every step, and I could feel it watching me. My body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to walk, one slow step at a time. When I finally turned the corner, the oppressive weight lifted. I didn't dare look back. By the time I returned to the security office, my nerves were shot. I slumped into the chair, staring at the monitors. One of the feeds showed the hallway I had just left. The figure was still there, but now it was standing closer to the camera, its face just barely visible. It wasn't human. I turned off the monitor, unable to look any longer. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were survival instructions. Whatever haunted this asylum, it had rules of its own, and I was now part of its twisted game. By the time my fourth shift rolled around, I was running on little sleep and a lot of caffeine. The rules were burned into my memory, each one like a silent warning that echoed in my thoughts. I didn't know who had written them, but I was certain of one thing. They weren't arbitrary. Someone had learned these rules the hard way, and they might have been the only reason I was still standing. The night began like the others. Empty hallways, flickering lights, and the heavy silence that seemed to breathe in the dark. I started my patrol, sticking strictly to the main floors and avoiding Ward C altogether. But tonight, something felt different. The asylum wasn't just quiet, It was waiting. As I moved through the central corridor, my flashlight caught something glinting on the floor near one of the nurses' stations. Curious, I knelt down and picked it up. It was a key, old and tarnished, with the words "Archives" engraved on the handle. I frowned. I hadn't seen an archives room on any of the maps or schedules I'd been given. Instinct told me to leave it alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. If there were archives, maybe I could finally get some answers about this place. What had happened here, why it had been abandoned, and most importantly, what was haunting it now. I searched for nearly an hour before I found the door. It was tucked away at the end of an unmarked hallway, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, and the door creaked open to reveal a steep staircase leading downward. My stomach twisted. Rule number 5. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. Technically, this wasn't the basement. At least, that's what I told myself as I took the first step. The air grew colder with each step I descended, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible in the dim light of my flashlight. The room was massive, lined with metal shelves stacked with dusty file boxes. Old medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, along with a few broken chairs and what looked like restraints. The walls were covered in faded posters with outdated slogans like "Care with Compassion" and "A New Era of Mental Health." But the most chilling feature was a large metal door at the far end of the room. It was bolted shut, with thick chains crossing its surface and a rusted padlock hanging in the center. Ignoring the door for now, I turned my attention to the shelves. Most of the boxes were unlabeled, but one near the front caught my eye. Written in black marker across the side were the words, "Incident Reports, Restricted Access." I pulled the box down, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. Inside, I found a stack of yellow documents, each one stamped with the asylum's name and a red "Confidential" label. I flipped through the files, my heart racing as I read the contents. The reports detailed a series of unexplained events that had occurred during the asylum's operation. Patients disappearing from locked rooms, staff members reporting shadowy figures following them, sudden outbreaks of violence among otherwise docile patients. One report described an entire ward waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about the same nightmare, a dark figure standing at the foot of their beds. Then I found the file that made my blood run cold. It was labeled simply, "The Experiment." According to the document, a group of researchers had been conducting secret experiments on the patients, using them as test subjects for something called Project Silent Veil. The goal was to study the effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation, but the reports hinted at something darker. Patients had been exposed to unclassified stimuli that resulted in hallucinations, paranoia, and, in some cases, death. One entry noted, subject number 17 claimed to hear voices instructing him to open the door. Subject became violent when restrained. The door didn't open, not fully, but something on the other side pushed against it, bulging the metal outward as if testing its limits. The chains rattled violently, and the low hum grew into a deep, guttural growl. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away. And then I saw it. Through the small, circular window in the door, something stared back at me. Its eyes were unnatural, bright, glowing slits that seemed to pierce through me. The face behind the glass wasn't human. Its features were twisted and grotesque, its skin stretched too tight over jagged bones. I felt a wave of nausea as it grinned, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Open the door," it whispered, its voice reverberating inside my skull. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. I reached for the stairs, desperate to escape, but the door shuttered again and the voice boomed, "Open the door!" The lights in the archives flickered violently, plunging the room into strobe-like chaos. Shadows danced across the walls, and the growl from behind the door grew into an ear-splitting roar. I bolted for the stairs, my legs shaking as I scrambled upward. Behind me, I heard the chains snap one by one, the sound echoing like gunshots in the confined space. I didn't stop until I reached the main floor, slamming the basement door shut and locking it with trembling hands. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. But the asylum didn't let me rest. As I stood there, gasping for air, the whispers returned. This time, they came from all around me, echoing through the halls in overlapping voices, and one word repeated over and over, growing louder with each iteration. "Run." I didn't stop running until I was outside the asylum, gulping in the cold night air like a drowning man breaking the surface. The building loomed behind me, its shattered windows and crumbling facade now darker and more menacing than ever. For a moment, I considered driving away and never looking back. But my car keys were still in the security office, and the thought of stepping back inside sent a wave of nausea through me. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do, when I noticed something strange. The air around me felt heavier again, and the wind, which had been dead still earlier, picked up in violent gusts. It howled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of those whispers. "Run!" I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but the asylum's front door remained firmly shut. The windows were black voids, offering no sign of movement within. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Somewhere deep inside that building, something was awake, and it knew I was still there. Against every ounce of instinct screaming at me to leave, I forced myself to go back inside. The moment the door shut behind me, the asylum seemed to exhale, its oppressive silence swallowing me whole. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I sprinted to the security office, grabbed my car keys, and prepared to leave for good. But as I turned to leave, the monitors caught my eye. One screen, in particular, was flickering, a live feed of the basement. My blood ran cold as I saw the metal door. It was wide open now, the chains that had once secured it lying in a twisted heap on the floor. Something moved on the screen. A shadow, slow and deliberate, crossed the frame. It was massive, its shape warped and wrong, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. I backed away from the monitors, my heart racing, but my eyes stayed fixed on the screen. The shadow turned toward the camera. Two glowing eyes locked onto the lens, and for a split second, I swore it smiled. I couldn't stay any longer. I bolted from the security office, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whispers grew louder with every step, overlapping voices that hissed and screamed, their words indistinguishable but full of malice. The main hallway felt endless, stretching far beyond what I remembered. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam dimming as the shadows around me deepened. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the creak of a door opening. "Leave." The voice wasn't in my head this time. It came from behind me, deep and guttural, filled with a chilling authority. I didn't dare look back. I reached the front doors and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them twice. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of rage and despair that filled every corner of the asylum. When I finally threw the door open, the night air hit me like a punch to the chest. I stumbled outside, slamming the doors shut behind me. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted to my car, barely managing to unlock it before throwing myself inside. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the asylum. The windows remained dark, but I could feel it watching me. Whatever was inside that building wasn't contained anymore. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the long driveway without looking back. The whispers faded the farther I drove, but the sense of dread clung to me like a second skin. I didn't stop driving until I reached the edge of town, parking at an all-night diner where the warm glow of fluorescent lights felt like salvation. I sat there for hours, staring at my shaking hands and trying to make sense of what had happened. No matter how I pieced it together, one fact was clear. The asylum wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And whatever had been locked behind that metal door was free now. I wanted to report everything, to tell someone, anyone, about what I'd seen. But who would believe me? A desperate night shift worker rambling about glowing eyes, whispers, and impossible shadows? Even if they did, I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else going back to that place. A week later, I found out the asylum had been boarded up. The company that hired me claimed it was due to structural concerns, but I knew better. Whatever was inside, they didn't want it getting out. Sometimes I still hear the whispers, faint and fleeting, just on the edge of my perception. They come when I'm alone, when the night is at its darkest. They don't scare me as much as they used to. If anything, they're a reminder, a warning that the asylum's secrets are still out there, waiting, and a part of me knows this isn't over.